The Kremlin is actively penetrating European politics, building a broad network of pro-Russian structures, including through so-called cultural diplomacy. It finances organizations and foundations worldwide. History, culture, orthodoxy, and the Russian-speaking diaspora are all treated as resources to be exploited. According to the European Commission and EU national security services, Russia systematically uses these humanitarian and cultural initiatives as part of its hybrid operations against Europe. How is the Russian World Network structured inside the EU? Why does Moscow's cultural influence shape public opinion across Europe? And what is the link between Russian opera and war? The popular term soft power was introduced by American political scientist Joseph Nye in 1990. It refers to a state's ability to gain influence not through military force, but by spreading its values and culture. For Russia, however, soft power has taken on a very different meaning. In the 2013 Russian foreign policy concept, soft power was formally enshrined as an official instrument of foreign policy influence. The document explicitly calls for the use of humanitarian, informational, and cultural mechanisms to protect Russia's interests abroad.
The thing is, Russian propaganda is not one single tool, it's a whole system. It includes direct influence through social media, through diplomats, through heads of state. But culture is also very much a tool of Russian propaganda. Through culture, which is actively promoted worldwide, Russia tries to portray itself as a liberator, as a heroic nation. The most dangerous moment is when Russian culture places Ukrainians and Russians on the same level, as if both are victims of aggression, completely ignoring the fact that Russia is the aggressor. It started this war and has been waging it since 2014. Yet that reality is pushed aside in favor of a softer, more emotionally appealing narrative. What follows is constant reinforcement from every direction. Here is a cultural event. Here is a historical exhibition. Here is Russian music, Russian literature, Russian art. Alongside it come Russian news outlets, television, commentary, and layered on top is the image of supposed heroism on the battlefield. Together, all of this forms a single, cohesive picture of Russia as a liberator. A Russia allegedly fighting Nazism, and at times even standing up to the West itself. In some European countries, Russia actively fuels anti-Western and anti-EU sentiment. The message is deliberately simple and attractive. Why stick together? Why be part of a coalition that supposedly forces you to support Nazism in Ukraine? Why not stand alone and make your own decisions? By spreading these ideas, Russia is not just advancing its own narrative, it is constructing a parallel anti-Western propaganda stream. And the two work together, reinforcing and amplifying each other.
Russia's cultural and humanitarian propaganda abroad is driven by three key Kremlin-linked structures: Rosotrudnichestvo, the Ruski Mir Foundation, and the Gorchakov Foundation. All are funded from the Russian federal budget and closely tied to the Kremlin administration. Using, among other things, the privileges of diplomatic status, especially in Europe, they carry out subversive and propaganda work. Rosotrudnichestvo positioned itself as the successor to the Soviet-era all-union society for cultural relations with foreign countries. After the collapse of the USSR, the Kremlin effectively privatized a vast network of so-called cultural diplomacy offices. Their network spans nearly the entire world. Promoting language, history, and diaspora ties is only a facade. The real goal is to build long-term influence among so-called pro-Russian citizens in each country. In practice, Russian houses function as overseas hubs for Russian propaganda and influence. Even after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, many remain active, shielded by diplomatic status and cultural cover.
Putin is the KGB, and the KGB was doing this long before Putin. All of these methods were tested and refined back in the Soviet Union. To understand how this mechanism works, you have to look further back and think more broadly. Yes, these Russian houses do exist. In Italy, for example, there is a Russian house in Rome that is extremely active. It hosts exhibitions, meetings here and there, encounters with the Pope, with that eccentric Nika Safronov who once presented them with a painting supposedly sent from space, and even meetings with the previous Pope, who soon after fell ill and passed away. The head of this Russian house is Daria Pushkova, the daughter of Senator Pushkov, a man who constantly hurls curses at Europe, calls it gay rope, and so on. These double standards shouldn't surprise anyone. The ideological wrapping doesn't even have to be explicit. Russian propaganda, especially cultural propaganda, works extremely well by adapting to local narratives. Anything that fits is used. If it operates in a place where separatist tensions resonate, it supports separatists. If the environment leans toward nationalist or fascist ideas, it supports the far right. In Italy, Russia funds both. Both radical wings are deeply hooked on Russian money, propaganda, and influence.
Putin's propaganda has taken deep root in Italy, particularly through soft power. This was enabled by Russian capital before 2022, close ties between pro-Russian politicians, including Silvio Berlusconi in the past, as well as business and cultural networks. Moscow entrenched an image of Russia in Italian public opinion as a country of high culture and a profitable business partner. As a result, discussion of Russian imperialism and its war of aggression is either pushed out of the public space or, more dangerously, justified.
Why does the myth of great Russian culture still hold? It was carefully nurtured for decades through connections and promotion. It's a self-declared, self-marketed myth. Russia as great, mysterious, enigmatic, and alternative reality. A bit fairy tale, a bit horror story, a bit spiritual homeland. Enormous effort was invested into this image. When people invest a lot into something, including their own belief in it, especially when that belief is shaped in schools and in Slavic studies departments, where scholars themselves were raised on the same myths, it doesn't collapse overnight. Sometimes it collapses brutally when a missile hits your home. But missiles don't hit Italian homes. Imagination falls short. The idea that culture has nothing to do with war is the key narrative, the slogan, the meme that Russian propagandists endlessly ride like a Trojan horse. Take Valery Gergiev. Canceling his concerts required enormous effort. The amount of resources mobilized to stop performances by such an openly pro-Putin figure, not just a musician, but a state functionary, head of 2 state theaters, directly linked to a dictator waging a genocidal war, was staggering. And even this obvious case met massive resistance. If we cancel music, how are we better than Putin's Russia? That's censorship, people said. Politicians said it too, including those who otherwise support Ukraine. This is exactly the Trojan horse that allows Russian influence to roll into Europe and into Italy with frightening ease.
After 2014, and especially after 2022, the Kremlin began to use well-known cultural figures more actively as informal ambassadors of the regime. In July, a concert was scheduled in the Italian city of Caserta, featuring an orchestra conducted by Russian conductor Valery Gergiev, with soloists from the Mariinsky Theater. Gergiev is a supporter of Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin regime. During the presidential elections of 2012 and 2018, he served as one of the Russian dictator's official proxies. And in 2014, he signed a letter by cultural figures supporting Putin's policies and the annexation of Crimea. In Russia, loyalty from artists and cultural figures is treated as a form of state service, while their international activity is viewed as an extension of foreign policy. In early March 2022, Gergiev refused to publicly condemn Russian aggression. As a result, he was removed from his post as chief conductor of the Munich Philharmonic and lost cooperation with a number of other EU institutions. The performance in Italy was meant to become Gergiev's first appearance at a European festival since February 2022.
I've tried many times to explain this connection myself, that first come the poets and the ballets, and then the missiles. It's extremely difficult to explain this to people who not only fail to see the link, but refuse to see it, and whose entire way of understanding the world has been shaped by Russia itself. Not directly, but indirectly. The idea that Russian literature is deeply infused with imperial narratives, imperial ideas, imperial xenophobia, and other related themes. That Putin did not emerge out of nowhere. That the repeated appearance of dictators on this imperial territory or on the semi-collapsed remains of an empire like Russia is not an accident, but a clear pattern. All of this struggles to break through the myth. Myths work better than rational knowledge. And when entire systems of education and scholarship, the very structure of knowledge about Russia, have largely been constructed by Russia itself and then projected onto the West, these myths become even harder to dismantle.
The main asset of Rosso-Trudnichestvo's structures in Europe is the Russian diaspora. It was through these communities that the propaganda campaign known as the Immortal Regiment was exported abroad. In addition, between 2012 and 2018 alone, more than 100 monuments, memorial plaques, and other sites glorifying the Soviet and Russian armies were installed across the EU. Memorials and military burial sites are being turned into hubs of Russian propaganda. Events held around them bring together politicians, activists, and cultural figures who echo Putin's slogans and spread disinformation.
Historical narratives are always difficult to explain. At the same time, they are very easy for Russia to manipulate. By organizing events like the Immortal Regiment in European countries, Russia tries to cement its image as a heroic nation. It reinforces that image with a modern storyline with what it is doing right now. The goal is to draw a historical parallel, to say we defeated Nazism once and we are fighting it again today. At the same time, even if we assume that Europeans generally understand what really happened, and understand that responsibility does not lie solely with the Soviet Union and therefore not solely with Russia, another question arises. Why does Russia spread such an enormous volume of propaganda on virtually every topic imaginable? Why does it twist every single fact, every day, every event? The answer is simple: to flood the information space with its own narratives, to do it so thoroughly that, for the target audience Russia works with, both inside the country and in Europe, there is no room left for truthful information. No space for real news. No space for an honest explanation of what is happening. By filling the information environment and creating a kind of vacuum made up entirely of Kremlin-written stories, Russia prevents people living inside that space from even pausing to think, from even asking themselves whether things might have been different.
In 2023 to 2024, funding for humanitarian and cultural programs abroad was increased despite sanctions. In October this year, Putin personally praised the work of Rosso-Trudnichestvo and outlined its key tasks, including preserving the memory of the so-called Great Patriotic War and advancing the Kremlin's version of an objective image of Russia abroad. In practice, this means promoting a Kremlin-friendly interpretation of World War II and justifying Russia's current aggression.
Because of the sheer amount of resources invested in this, and now it seems they've almost doubled. I've seen the budget. They reach an enormous number of people in many different ways. Even sanctions haven't stopped them. Last year, for example, RT managed to place banners near Milan and in other major cities. Banners saying, "They are hiding the truth from you, we will tell it." That's a sanctioned outlet, a direct violation of the law. And then there are countless events, cultural presentations, book launches, film screenings. There are permanent local actors involved, Italians who organize and promote these things. We know them. European radical activists and politicians even created a map called Putin's Plague, documenting propaganda events, screenings of films about Donbass, book presentations, all wrapped in seemingly neutral, literary, or cinematic packaging. It often feels like we've managed to cancel a huge number of these events. We write complaints, we explain why they are propaganda, but in reality, there are hundreds of them. And all of this rests on a dense network of personal connections, built not in a day and not even in a decade. This network runs deep and is still not fully understood. For years, it developed quietly, below the threshold of public attention. Awareness is now growing rapidly, especially as the security dimension becomes impossible to ignore. More and more drones are visibly circling European military bases, turning what once seemed abstract into something tangible and immediate.
Cultural influence and information operations often come before more aggressive forms of pressure. Soft power lowers the sense of threat and creates an atmosphere of Russia's normal presence. Germany is one of the clearest examples. Germany's Federal Criminal Police Office has recorded more than 1,000 cases of suspicious drone flights since the beginning of the year. Most of them have appeared over military facilities, airports, and critical infrastructure. At the same time, Germany is planning to close the Russian House in Berlin. Its status, similar to that of the Goethe Institute in Moscow, is regulated by a 2011 German-Russian agreement. That agreement remains in force and stipulates that Germany pays 70,000 euros in annual property tax for the complex on Friedrichstrasse.
It is unacceptable for this propaganda organization to continue receiving our money while being used by Russia to wage an information war against us. Robin Wagner, member of the German Bundestag.
I think it's time to prepare Europe for a simple reality. If you continue to support Russian culture and, figuratively speaking, keep letting Russian art into your home, you also let in narratives of Russian propaganda. If you allow Russian houses to operate in your country, to host exhibitions of Russian photography, painting, artists, cinema, or anything else, you normalize that presence. This part of Russian culture has already shown itself clearly in Ukraine. It arrived with destruction and suffering. And if it is welcomed without question, it may, unfortunately, come to your home as well.
We have ballets, culture, look how cultured we are, how spiritual, how special. We are at war, but we were forced into it. Nobody wants war. We all want peace. We hope for peace. This narrative is also being exploited. We were forced. We had no choice. We were provoked. But this is exactly the same rhetoric Hitler used. All aggressors do this. All abusers, even at the level of a family, always say the same thing. We were made to do it. We were pushed. We are never the aggressor. We are always the victim of circumstances or of someone else. That's why you see all these propaganda films about our poor boys supposedly fighting in the trenches. They didn't want this. They want peace. Everyone wants peace. That's the story. Russia's task is to normalize its aggression, to cover it up, to make it appear acceptable, and, in a sense, to make Europe and its voters helpless, to suppress the natural immune response that arises when there is danger, to dull the sense of threat.
Russian cultural diplomacy is part of a systematic hybrid strategy aimed at undermining trust, fragmenting societies, and weakening the political will of EU countries. Museums, film festivals, concerts, literary evenings, and so-called historical discussions are used by the Kremlin to promote the narrative of a democratic and unfairly isolated Russia. Russian houses, tours by propagandist artists, festivals, exhibitions, and pseudo-documentary films are not art. They are elements of hybrid operations through which the Kremlin seeks to rewrite reality and preserve its influence within the European Union. Through so-called soft power, Russia attempts to mask its war crimes in Ukraine and prepare the ground for further expansion to the West.